In the name of the Holy, Undivided Trinity, one God. Amen. The capacity to feed oneself, to clothe oneself, to provide transportation, to educate self and family, these days determine so much of how one lives life in this world. But that's only part of the story. The ways that we interact as a worldwide human society also matter. Consider how threats to peace and security everywhere affect every other place, or threats to developing countries where essentials for healthy lives are already scarce. Threats to human rights, for one, undermine rights for everyone. Threats to justice make it more challenging to hold wrongdoers accountable. Threats to international law and security, as far away as the other side of the globe, threaten security here at home. All of these threats erode the ability of people everywhere to take care of those essentials for family, self, and our neighbors. Any threat against just one human denies the image of God that is embedded deeply in that person. If this is so for humans, it is most certainly valid for the rest of creation, that if we deny the image of God in creation, it creates a problem for all of creation. We can see around us how we pay the price for denying God's image, all around us, in all creation, in each one of us, because you and I are bearers of God's image. Because we are that, we are called to be champions for God, honoring God's image in all that is of God's creation. Athanasius was one such champion for God. He earned the title Noble Champion of Christ. On the other hand, his enemies gave a disparaging title to him that, frankly, I feel would be inappropriate to quote word for word, but you get the idea. All of this is to say that his enemies disparaged him for being different in faith, different in appearance, different skin color. They mocked his physical size, when what they were really getting at was his major difference, that he was a faithful servant of Jesus. Such is the price that one pays for truth-telling in this life. None of what others said to or about Athanasius held him back in his faithfulness. They couldn't stop him, and their efforts to silence him further amplified the truth of his words that we remember today. Now, he was born in the year 267. So can you imagine 2 sentences of yours being remembered 1,000 or 1,800 years from now? Wouldn't that be nice? Especially if it were something like this. He said that no part of creation is left void of God. God has filled all things everywhere. He wasn't saying anything new, but he was summarizing the nature of God's creation from so long ago. Let his words sink in for a moment. No part of creation is left void of God. God has already filled all things everywhere. God has already filled everything everywhere, even if humanity fails to see God in those things. Take Lazarus, for example, in today's gospel. Now, he's not to be confused with Mary and Martha's brother, Lazarus, a different person. This Lazarus is a featured character in a parable, and this portion of Luke's gospel is a lesson, a parable, a story to make a point. And in this story, this character, Lazarus, is too weak to fight off even the stray dogs that survive by eating trash on the streets, who come and lick Lazarus's wounds. Lazarus, who is capable of only eating off of the crumbs of the rich man's table. This is the third parable in Luke's gospel that is about the rich and the poor. So just the fact that there are three parables in Luke about this dynamic of the haves and the have-nots means that it was pretty important. Luke felt it was important enough to provide three of Jesus' stories to those who Luke was addressing his gospel to. In this parable, the poor man has a name, Lazarus. Did you notice what the name of the rich man was? It's not because you were bad listeners, it's because the rich man did not have a name. So that's how the gospel turns the tide. It's how God shapes and humanity's shapes are often opposed to one another. The rich have no name, the poor are named. Now, in Jewish writings from the time of Jesus, the afterlife is often described as one of division. God's angels, God's messengers, when one dies, divide those who have died into places of rest or suffering, depending on how well they served God while they're alive. So we know how well Lazarus served God by being in a nice place after his death, and how the rich man with no name did not do so well in his service to God in this life, therefore goes to the other place, and there's a great chasm dividing the two that cannot be crossed. The rich man, who has now died, assumes that all of the same rules on earth apply in the afterlife. Well, of course the poor should come and dip a finger to wet my tongue while I suffer in these flames and in this awful atmosphere, only to learn that that's not how God's economy, God's kingdom truly works. And also, even the rich man knows Lazarus by name. Nothing will change the minds of people if they don't believe God's truth according to tradition. It is like when the resurrected Christ appears, still some doubt, and they continue to live their lives denying the truth of the resurrection. Jesus invites all to live according to God's provision. This is the point of his life, the point of the Gospels, to honor the image of God that is stilled in all things that are created by God. One of our Eucharistic prayers proclaims it this way: "It is in God that all things move and live and have their being." That's from an epistle as well. When we continue to ignore God's image, we do so to our own peril and to the further destruction of what God created and calls good. Brother Keith, who is a brother of the Society of St. John the Evangelist in Boston, explains it this way: when we violate, abuse, exploit, or even ignore non-human creatures, we reject a core dimension of our own humanity, and we reject a core dimension of God's call to each of us. In that denial, we are crucifying the earth. We are interrupting, speaking over, or bickering with God's gentle language of love, in which each creature is like a syllable of the living word. Each creature is an instance of divine gift. I'm just thinking of, we saw a fox this morning on our way to church, and then a pair of blue jays caught our attention. There was also a skunk on the way here. Thinking of the variety of God's creation and how God's image is in each of those creatures, right? Or the beautiful land that we enjoy when we look out of our windows or when we go for a walk. Those are all divine gifts. Brother Keith goes on that these are gifts, not only to us, but they are gifts that God gives to God's self. And they speak the love language of the Holy Trinity. He goes on to say that we believe God became a creature in Jesus Christ, and we believe that Jesus Christ redeemed creation from the inside out, so that we creatures can participate directly in this infinite pattern of God's giving and receiving. Lazarus chose such a path. The call of God is not to the impossible, though we might think this is ridiculous, totally impossible. Obviously, Luke has not read the front page of the newspaper this weekend, but no, God does not ask us to do impossible things. God's call is always to do what is possible. All may live following the way of Jesus. It is possible, using the way of God's gentle language of love, in which we honor all that God creates. All that God has made and continues to generate is an element of the living Word. That living Word is God's very essence. And for us, the living Word is also Jesus, an expression of God's very essence, who is love, reminding us that that is what we are also called to. I say this to you in the name of the Holy, Undivided Trinity, one God. Amen.